The local ranger, Mr. Alejandro, spent his whole life in the village in Catalonia, in the harsh but uniquely beautiful and attractive areas. Here he grew up, matured, and aged. His wife passed away 13 years ago, and at that time he thought life was over, but he still found the strength to carry on, and his beloved craft helped him greatly in this. His daughter got married and moved to the city of Alicante, visiting her father not as often as both of them would have liked. Our country is still large, and the grandfather saw his grandson, who was already 12 years old at that time, approximately once every 2 years. This year was just like that. For the entire 2-week vacation, his daughter and grandson flew to visit the old man, to enjoy the pristine nature, and, of course, to listen to his famous stories. "Grandpa, do you know stories about tigers?" Valerio asked with undisguised interest, sitting next to Mr. Alejandro. "I don't know about tigers, but I can tell you about a tigress, would you like that?" Mr. Alejandro replied with a grin. "Well then, listen." And Grandpa Alejandro began his story. "About 20 years ago, it was like it was yesterday, I was already an experienced ranger, knew the local forests like the back of my hand, was on first-name terms with the firearms, and also with the local fauna. It was late spring, the rivers were free from ice, the snow was getting less and less, the bright sun was caressing the skin more and more often, the trees and firs were turning green, and everything around was beginning to be dotted with bright colors. Our house stood on the outskirts, closest to the forest, literally 40 steps from the fence across the road. On that day, I was just doing regular chores, digging the garden, feeding the animals, tidying up the area, in general, the daily routine of a country dweller. My wife wasn't falling behind either, bustling around the house, cooking, cleaning. What happened on that day etched into my memory for the rest of my life. I had noticed various animals on the edge of the forest before. Mr. Alejandro looked at Valerio, who was hanging on to his every word. Well, so it was the most ordinary, unremarkable day. I was busy in the yard, when suddenly out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the figure of a beast darting through the trees on the edge of the forest. A very unusual beast, very rare, one that an ordinary person is unlikely to see in their lifetime. I thought it couldn't be true, that I was imagining things, and I continued with my chores. Literally a minute later, in the trees, there was another flicker, and she emerged from the forest. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a big tigress. She stood still and looked at me with a piercing gaze. Inside, I went cold, my heart sank. As an experienced hunter, I understood that I wouldn't even have time to run away. She could cover that distance in 3 leaps. I mentally went through all the possible options, but the tigress didn't rush to attack. She looked at me as if studying me, trying to understand if she could trust me. A little later, the forest resident turned around and disappeared into the forest again. That's when I noticed that the fur on her hind leg was stained with blood. The tigress was wounded. At that time I didn't know if she was injured by herself or if a human had a hand in it. I found out the truth a little later. A minute later, she appeared again. I stood there rooted to the spot, trying to comprehend what was happening. The tigress held a blind little tiger cub in her mouth, no more than a month old. She looked at me intently again and placed the cub on the grass, then disappeared into the woods again. The cub cried and called for his mom, but she left, leaving the striped bundle alone. I stood there for a long time, watching, not daring to approach and trying to understand the tigress's actions. Only a little later, when I finally moved closer and decided to approach, did I realize that she left him hoping I would take care of him, because wounded as she was, she wouldn't be able to cope. I carefully picked up the foundling from the grass and headed towards the house. Miss Maria, my wife, seeing me with the tiger cub in my hands, nearly fainted. At that moment, she probably thought I had gone crazy. I had to briefly recount the events of the last 10 minutes. It was difficult to believe in such a thing, of course, but a real live tiger cub in the house left no room for doubt. After some discussion, we decided to keep him with us and, once he was stronger, release him into the forest, as there were very few of these striped creatures left in the world. Days and months passed, and Amatis, as we named the tiger cub, slowly settled in. For the first month, Miss Maria fed him from a bottle with a nipple, like a little baby, and then we switched him to a regular predator's meat diet. Fortunately, I was a skillful hunter, and there was never a shortage of meat at home. Surprisingly, the wild animal got along well with our cat and domestic animals. He played like an ordinary household pet, romping around, misbehaving, wreaking havoc, and was practically tame. Both Miss Maria and I grew very attached to him, but deep down we knew that sooner or later we would have to part with him. Amatis grew not by days, but by hours. At 9 months old, he weighed over 50 kilograms and was the size of a large dog. Keeping him hidden from curious eyes became increasingly difficult, and if someone unkind found out, trouble awaited, as a tiger was a very valuable prey, and the skin was worth a lot of money. Not all people around were as kind and compassionate. We had to let Amatis go home to the vast forest expanses. Parting was very difficult. I led the tiger a little further into the forest, sat down, and said, "Run, run, beauty, home is waiting." He looked at me for a long time. I was most afraid that he wouldn't leave and would get attached to me. But instinct prevailed, and Amatis, turning around, disappeared from view into the depths of the forest with a few leaps. I watched him go for a while, taking a few deep breaths of fresh forest air, and then headed back home. "That's how your grandmother and I saved the tiger cub and gave him a ticket to life," Grandpa Alejandro said contentedly, looking meaningfully up. "Grandpa, wait, what happened to the tigress after all? You said you only found out the truth later." Valerio persisted. "Well, I was waiting for you to ask, checking to see if you were listening carefully to my story. So, here it is. Although our region is large, everyone knows everyone in the local villages, and rumors spread pretty quickly. A couple of months after we took in Amatis, word got out that the police had detained a group of poachers who had set up camp in the forest, and they were arrested under very strange circumstances. In the morning, 2 men emerged from the forest into one of the villages. They looked awful, dirty, scared, battered, and out of breath. It was clear they had been running headlong for a long time. When they were asked what had happened to them, they stuttered heavily and couldn't explain for a long time. After recovering from the shock a bit, they finally told the story that a tiger had attacked their friend in the forest and a doctor was needed. The men didn't believe it. Hardly anyone had ever seen a real tiger in their entire lives, let alone one attacking people. That was just nonsense. But after a while and exchanging glances, they instructed them to show the location. Taking weapons with them just in case, the men, along with the local paramedic and the local policeman, set off after the unfortunate hunters. What awaited them at the scene was an unpleasant sight. Only the name of the tent camp remained. The devastation was such that boards, branches, tent scraps, clothing, and various utensils were mixed up and scattered around. This place resembled more of a dump than a camp. Among all this mess, lay 2 men groaning in pain. The paramedic examined them and immediately realized that a large predator had been at work. They were badly mauled. It attacked the camp under cover of night while everyone was asleep, which is why the men didn't even have time to understand what was happening. But luck wasn't on their side, and the others managed to fight back and, as we already know, make it to the nearest village. The paramedic ordered makeshift stretchers to be constructed from available materials and the wounded to be transported to the settlement as quickly as possible, and from there to the nearest hospital for treatment. As later inspection of the scene showed, these were well-prepared poachers engaged in illegal hunting. They were detained and gave statements. One of them explained that a couple of months ago, they had tracked down a tigress with 2 cubs. They managed to capture one cub, wounded the tigress, but she managed to escape with the second cub, which was why she came to the camp to seek revenge. However, the police never believed the tiger version. They attributed everything to a bear and the shock experienced by the men. The police found the poacher's story too incredible. Valerio looked at his grandfather with his mouth wide open. "Grandpa, did they all get punished in the end?" "Of course they were punished, they got what they deserved by law. And although nobody believed the tiger story, I knew who actually came to the camp to settle the score for her cub." Mr. Alejandro finished his story. "Go to sleep, it's time already. Tomorrow I'll tell you another new story."